Good morning, everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are situated. And welcome to this webinar on the European political community. I hope you can hear me okay. Otherwise, please indicate that. My name is Clausen. I'm a journalist here at the Danish Institute of International Studies in Copenhagen. And I will do my best to guide us through the next hour. And luckily, I am not alone in doing that, because that would give you very limited insights on the EPC. So I am joined by two people who have followed the EPC closely, namely Fabrizio Tassinari, who's the Executive Director of School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and Teona Giuashvili, who is a visiting fellow also at the European University Institute. So just to get us started, I am absolutely sure that many of you already know basically what the EPC is. Just to get us all up to speed, the EPC was established in October 2022. It comprises 44 European heads of state and government, including all 27 member states of the EU, as well as governments of neighbouring countries, neighbouring European countries, most notably the United Kingdom, Ukraine, Turkey, the Western Balkans, and the southern Caucasus nations. It was initially proposed by Emmanuel Macron in May 2022, and the idea was to establish, quote, a new European organization that would allow countries that subscribe to our shared core values to find a new space for cooperation on politics, security, energy, infrastructure, investment, and migration. So we are going to hear a lot more today about the EPC and sort of what its aims are and so on. But before we get into the specifics, Fabrizio, I would like to ask you, what was the broader European political situation that led up to the founding of the EPC? Maybe you could give us an overview of some relevant recent historic events.
I will try my best. Thanks, Jon, and good morning to or afternoon to everyone. Let's say, instead of taking one step back, let's take two steps back, starting from before the war even. Because I think the rationale for creating this new political animal, if we want to call it that way, I think in some respects precedes even the war, and that is in the way in which the European Union and European member states in particular have been relating to their neighbors in the East before the war. And to use a phrase that I think is attributed to Kissinger, we never know if he really said it or not. It's always like that with Kissinger, but it's been his birthday recently, so let's assume it was him. It was a constructive ambiguity sort of approach. Constructive ambiguity meaning that the EU, for about a decade or so after the biggest enlargement in its history in 2004, wasn't really in a position to continue expanding, and we can come back to the reason why that is so. It certainly didn't feel in a position to continue expanding, and instead it tried to engage the countries, particularly in the East, but also in the South. But of course, the war made it all the more apparent that the key is really in the East, via a number of policy instruments. The heading was and is called the European Neighbourhood Policy, but really the bottom line was to somehow offer these countries, namely Ukraine, Moldova, even Belarus at the time, and of course the South Caucasus countries of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, a number of incentives and benefits ranging from market access to mobility of people, in the hope that this would trigger reforms and this would trigger domestic transformation. The trade-off worked in the case of enlargement, so they could assume and hope that it would work also in this case. I think it's fair to say that it did not, and this is irrespective of Russia. We're going to get to that, but it did not because clearly the incentive structure was not in place. I mean, they had no obvious incentive to do this, because the key incentive is really membership into the European institutions, and that was not in the cards. So I mentioned it was about a decade since the enlargement of 2004, and if in retrospect you go back, it was precisely in 2014. If you ask Ukrainians, they will tell you that the war really started for them in 2014, because that is really the culmination, or maybe even the inflection point when this approach of constructive ambiguity came to a head. In 2014, the EU tried the most ambitious of these arrangements with Ukraine in the form of a free trade agreement with Ukraine, which would have meant that Ukraine not only had market access to the EU, but was also aligning to a lot of its regulations in all sorts of sectors. And I suppose from looking at this from Brussels, but also from Berlin or Paris, this looked innocuous and innocent enough, meaning it would not provoke Russia, or it would not be perceived as a geopolitical move that would, make Russia feel that Europe was encroaching in its sphere of interest. Again, constructive ambiguity. It was very ambiguous on that front, but with the understanding maybe it's not going to harm anybody. Well, that was not the case. I mean, clearly, and here for sure we should start entering Russia's own reasoning. Russia perceived this as an intrusion, and Putin made that very clear already at the time. That if Ukraine chose the EU, it would not choose its own trade area in the former Soviet space. And as they say, the rest is history. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the reasons that led Russia to war and to the invasion somehow were preceded by a weak posture on the side of the EU and of its policies. Now, the meeting, and I'm going to stop there because this is where we really enter the fray. The meeting that led to the European political community back in the fall, that was in Prague, was at that stage primarily a symbolic move. It was precisely about saying the time for constructive ambiguity is over. The war made it clear to us, and we need to clearly say who is in and who is out. And it was an act of defiance. It was an act of standing on the side of Ukraine, but it was also indirectly a way of saying whatever we did so far didn't work. And now, we are back in the situation where we have to tell clearly who is in and who is out. And I will stop there for now.
Very interesting. That's a very helpful background to see the formation of the EPC. And then Teona, I'd like to ask you then, what does it look like today, the EPC? How is it structured now? Fabrizio mentioned that initially maybe a symbolic move, but now it has more of a structure, specific structure. What are its aims? Can you tell us some more about the specifics of the EPC, please?
Thank you, Jan. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to engage in this discussion with you and Fabrizio. So, yes, since summer 2022, there has been a lot of debate on the European political community trying to define its raison d'être, its modus operandi, and priorities. And all these questions still exist, still persist on all these aspects. However, these two summits, the first in Prague and the second in Chișinău, have provided some clues. on what the EPC is, what it is not, what it stands for, and what it can deliver. So first of all, the EPC is a new addition to European governance landscape, but it's not an institutionalized organization. So it's an informal intergovernmental forum, which puts all its participants, by now 47 countries, on an equal footing. So irrespective of their membership to the European Union or NATO. So EPC has no secretariat, no institutional framework, and no decision-making mechanism. And EPCs don't produce political declarations or conclusions as other European Councils do. So, and the presidency rotates among member countries, and the country holding the presidency proposes the agenda of the summit. So in short, nothing is set in stone, neither membership and nor the pace of the meetings. The EPC is not a community of democracy, bringing together countries that share common values. So it's a community of countries that are united in their aspiration to uphold international law and peace in Europe in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and to advance their interests through dialogue rather than through conflict and confrontation. So as for the context, Fabrizio mentioned already, so Russia's attack on Ukraine and the consequent reopening of the debate on the enlargement that set the stage for President Macron's proposal in May 2022 to create the EPC. At the outset, the initiative was not really embraced with enthusiasm because many were skeptical. They thought that Paris tried again to sideline prospects for EU enlargement to Eastern Europe. So in this context, it was a decision of the European Council in June 2022 that really unblocked the support for the EPC. And the general conclusion was that there was no risk that the new format would stifle enlargement. Now, a few words about the roles that the EPC fulfills or could fulfill. The broader point I would like to make is that EPC will shape up what it will do, and also what it will deliver. It will depend certainly on convergence among member countries and on its ability also to find a proper place among European organizations. So the first function, as I mentioned, that there is already consensus that among European countries that EPC and EU enlargement process are separate processes, and they each is driven by distinct goals and each is based on different procedures. However, separate does not really mean that they are disconnected. So the EPC could help foster political engagement between EU member states and the European states that are beyond the European Union, and enable community building at the level of heads of state and government. EPC could both create positive environment to raise this issue, to give impetus to the enlargement process, and also offer the opportunity to informally address the complications that EU enlargement process might encounter over the coming years. The second role that the EPC could fulfill is to evolve into an inclusive forum for security dialogue. So building confidence among its members and helping prevent and manage crises on the continent. So it's in short terms, it is obviously imperative to sustain, to preserve this common front and shape a common European narrative against Russia's war. But in addition, the EPC could perform as a venue for strategic dialogue, so on Europe's political and security agenda beyond this war, especially considering that the OSCE is broadly stalled due to Russia's destructive behavior. And on top of this, the EPC can play a useful role in discussions over contentious security matters and promoting deconfliction among its members that we have also seen in Prague and in Chișinău. And third role, and I will end here, is that the EPC may also play a useful role to foster cooperation between EU members and non-members, so in various fields. And the areas that have been often mentioned as relevant in these directions are energy, connectivity, education, climate change, in terms of security cooperation as well, such as to strengthen cyber resilience or security of critical infrastructure. So certainly this is not the only format where this cooperation can happen. However, due to its pan-European scope, the EPC can bridge different sub-regional initiatives and encourage cooperation among willing coalitions and groups of states. So far, it's not so much clear that there is real willingness by member states to use the EPC for practical policy cooperation. I will end here.
All right, thank you, Teona. That's very helpful. I just wanted to say, in terms of the structure of today, that we will end with a Q&A. So please, along the way, consider your questions, and we will finish with those. And there is a Q&A button. I think that our event manager already posted something around that, where to answer questions. But Teona, just to follow up on this, because you briefly mentioned that there was the meeting in Chișinău on June 1st. Could you say a little bit more about what was the outcome of that meeting? Do we see some specific there, some concrete outcome? Oh, you are muted.
I'm sorry. Yes, Fabrizio mentioned that the main value of Prague summit was symbolic. And I would say that we can say the same about the recent summit of the EPC in Chișinău. So it had political and symbolic value. First of all, the meeting of 49 European leaders, so once again displayed European unity in the face of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So this is important in itself. And all the leaders who were invited, they were present in Moldova, except the Turkish president, who was sworn into office the day after. Second, the summit also sent a strong message of solidarity and support to Moldova, a country that is vulnerable and that is exposed to the threats stemming from Russia. And so this event certainly focused attention on the host country and reinforced its European orientation and profile image. So beyond the optics, the Chișinău summit has also been used quite pragmatically by Ukraine and Moldova to make a plea for accelerating the EU accession process. So they use bilateral meetings to press this message. And this probably goes back to what I have recently mentioned, is that even if there is no formal connection between EU enlargement and the EPC, and rightly so, so the EPC can be still instrumental to sustain political momentum for EU enlargement. The second summit also strengthened the role of the EPC as a platform for pan-European consultation on dealing with Russia's aggression. In particular, so President Zelensky held numerous exchanges in Chișinău, seeking security guarantees for Ukraine, vis-a-vis especially to the NATO summit in Vilnius. In addition to this, so in terms of deconfliction, so a number of meetings took place at the margins of the summit. The leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan met in Moldova, together with the French president, the president of the European Council, and in this case also the Chancellor of Germany. And the second summit also provided an opportunity to address the rising tensions between Serbia and Kosovo. So by convening a meeting that involved the respective leaders and also France, Germany, and the High Representative. As for the specific and sectoral policy agendas, because this has been also claimed as one of the functions that EPC could assume, so there is not much to signal. There is little information about the proceedings of the 3 thematic meetings that took place in Chișinău on security, on energy, and connectivity. The decision that was announced to lower roaming charges between the EU and Moldova certainly is important, and it would certainly bring benefits to Moldovan citizens. But it's not really clear to what extent the EPC summit contributed to this deliverable. So to sum up, I would say that the Chișinău summit has confirmed the principal role of the EPC more as a informal intergovernmental forum, more as a platform to discuss political and security issues, and less as a forum that generates policy initiatives and sectoral cooperation. So at least for the time being.
Excellent. Thank you, Teona. That gets us up to date for sure on the development of the EPC. So Fabrizio, I want to ask you, maybe looking into a little bit more into the future here, what the formation of EPC tells us about the future of Europe, and in particular, what does it mean for the EU? Because we have this, obviously you both described the relation to the EU, how it is related, how it's not related, and so on. So what can we say about that?
Yes, so let me answer in two parts. The first is really following up in the sequencing. I think it was very good with what Teona was just explaining about the EPC, because this informal structure, a symbolic structure, doesn't mean to say that this is only fluff or this is only appearances. There is a lot of value in it. Bear in mind that all other organizations that, prior to the war, included member states of the EU and non-member states, oftentimes they were really blocked in their proceedings because of Russia. This applies to the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Council of Europe, which recently also took a stand on that. And so I think, there is the symbolism is important, but the symbolism also has a value in itself. And here the value is also in not setting this new political animal up for failure by creating a very heavy structure. Because what often happens in these cases is that if you start discussing, should we have a secretariat? Where are we going to put the secretariat? Who is going to pay for the secretariat? That's the time when country will start to disagree. And I guess, there is a little ghost in this setup that is often mentioned, which is the Union for the Mediterranean. And the Union for the Mediterranean was created, has in common with the EPC, the godfather, which is the French government. And I think at the time it started out with it's a different context. It's about the North Africa and the Middle East and Europe, but it started out with a similar impetus. And then, I would say, as of now, that is a dormant organization, because it became about, precisely creating a secretariat, and then it became very much a French initiative that didn't really increase ownership from other countries. So what I would say first is that the symbolism to remain strong requires, first of all, that the ownership is somewhat shared and transferred. These summits taking place once inside the European Union and once outside the European Union is actually very helpful. I think it could be very helpful. And paradoxically, the second thing to really keep the momentum is not to bog it down with institutions and organizations. So that's one side of the answer. The second side of the answer is actually then what is supposed to happen at the institutional level to substantiate the value that this organization has, the symbolic value. And what needs to happen, and should be, in my view, be kept strictly separate from the EPC, is the enlargement discussion primarily in the EU. Of course, there's also the NATO question. We can take that separately, but let's stick to the EU now. As I've seen already in the Q&A, of course, we are now focusing for good reason on Eastern Europe and Ukraine and Moldova. But of course, the EPC includes also the Western Balkan countries. And we also know very well that the Western Balkan countries have been in queue waiting for the better part of the past 2 decades. And To say that they have lost hope in the enlargement is an understatement. I think there is a serious credibility issue in the whole enlargement process. And this will now include not only the Balkans, but also Ukraine and Moldova, the credibility issue. I would say there is an issue of precedence, in the sense that the Balkans have been in queue for a much longer time, and they would understandably in some cases want to see progress for them as well. So I think my sort of message here, and I think we should probably discuss what then we could do in the enlargement context to really make it, to revive it and make it more credible. My sort of takeaway for the moment is to say, keep the enlargement discussion separate from the EPC, but that's where the real work will have to take place, while the EPC will remain a symbolic forum where the symbolism is really not only, it is really where politics take place, and where, you know, if you want to make a comparison that is perhaps inappropriate, but it could give a sense. You remember during the financial crisis in 2008, when the G8 at the time, it was with Russia still, then expanded to the G20. No, and the G20 still exists, and it was precisely aimed at, you know, bringing in the actors that really should have a say in that case about international financial architecture and the rest of it. I think you can make a parallel in that respect. There is the need to symbolically show that we are doing something radically different.
Very interesting. Teona, you're from Georgia, and I was when I first heard about the EPC, I must admit that it was after Fabrizio actually sent me the policy brief that I think will be the link to, because it was not something that got a lot of attention in the broader Danish press, at least not the one I follow apparently. But I don't know if that was the case necessarily in Georgia, but I was just wondering that, speaking from what we could say it's sort of a wider European perspective than just the EU, how is the EPC conceived from there? What do you think in that optic could be the contribution of the EPC?
Thank you, Jan. Probably before speaking about Georgia and how the EPC is perceived from there by Georgia, as you have mentioned, wider Europe, I think that I felt I should recall how difficult it was for my country, for Moldova, for Ukraine, to get recognition of its European choice and aspiration, because this resonates also with what Fabrizio mentioned about constructive ambiguity and EU approach to its neighborhood. So back in 2003, when the first wider Europe communication of the Commission was published, Georgia and the entire South Caucasus fell outside the EU's plans to develop new approach to its neighborhood. Afterwards, certainly it has been corrected. And then throughout endless negotiations and debates, EU and member states systematically denied Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine recognition of their identity as European states, and therefore also their membership perspective. And I think that when thinking of wider Europe, Georgia always sought to stress identity over geography, so choice of the country over history, and the right to decide also the future of the country over Russia's droit de regard. And so today, debate has moved on, and as Fabrizio mentioned at the beginning, taboos have been broken, and the door to the EU accession has opened. However, unfortunately, it took the EU Russia's full-fledged aggression against Ukraine to think differently about wider Europe and to shift its policy towards the eastern neighbors. So I think that when thinking about wider Europe, I would say that where you sit is where you stand. So different visions and the different perceptions, whether country a member of the EU or at the outskirts of Europe. As for Georgia's approach to the EPC, so one of the main factors that reassured Georgia and led it to embrace this initiative was exactly that the EPC would not be a substitute to the EU accession process or a waiting room for EU enlargement. And once this was reassured, certainly that there was no obstacle to embrace this idea. And my view is that we see EPC as an enabler rather than an obstacle to EU enlargement and to European integration. And as for the priorities, I would raise I assume that there are two main priorities that Georgia should advance and should put on the agenda of the EPC. So first of all, security challenges and security threats that Georgia faces from Russia, and try to mobilize, consolidate support of the continent and of European countries in addressing those challenges. So I don't want to go too far, but it was in 2008, in August 2008, that Russia really was first time that violated international law, the territorial integrity, sovereignty of the country so openly, so blatantly. And since then, 20% is occupied. 10,000 Russian troops are stationed in Georgia's two regions. And in addition to the military buildup, cyber, hybrid warfare and coercive and malicious interference. So Georgia has been vulnerable to those interferences. And I think that EPC provides a good fora to raise this issue and try to strengthen Georgia's resilience of society and resilience of the state. And the second issue, I would say, is connectivity. There are already certainly pipelines and infrastructure that connects Georgia to Europe, but I think that there is more potential, and this potential needs to be operationalized. And I believe that this transnational Caspian international transport route could be one of the initiatives that EPC were discussed within the EPC, due to also this wider membership that EPC provides and pan-European character, because EPC brings all the relevant and the interested countries to the table. So I would say these two priorities, security and connectivity, that Georgia needs to advance and actively put on the agenda.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And just before we move into the Q&A, I would like to ask you both the same question, but maybe I'll start with you, Fabrizio. What would you say are the EPC's main strengths and weaknesses, and what will success versus failure look like for the EPC?
Yeah, thanks. Of course, this is a little bit a crystal ball sort of operation, but I guess we are in that sort of business as well. Now, the subtitle of this seminar is called Putting Politics First. And I would say, I would like to use 1 minute to really substantiate that, what that actually means, because for me, that would be the measure of success. And if we follow what we have been saying until now, I think the EPC will be a success story if it manages in its political symbolism to substantiate real work at the level of accession into the EU, given that the two processes are separate. But the problem so far, which the Russia invasion has made untenable, is that the EU has always assumed and presumed that the enlargement process is a technical exercise where you have to tick some boxes and do some things, and then the Commission tells you that you have done your homework. But the paradox of that is that we all know that really it is a political exercise. It is not only a technical exercise. It has always been also a political exercise. The accession in 2004 was a political decision eventually. The decision to delay Romania and Bulgaria, but then admit them in 2007 was also a political decision. And the same will have to be eventually the case for these countries that now are in line. And therefore, you know, if every 6 months, indeed, when there is a summit, you have 44 member states, or sorry, the 44 countries saying Ukraine, Moldova, the 6 Western Balkan countries are going to be members of the EU, and you repeat this over and over and over. Repetition sometimes is important. There is that element there that will make it eventually a reality. Now, to make it a reality, there is a lot of homework to do to reform the enlargement process. I'm happy to take this up in the Q&A because I think this is probably already in some of the questions. I really would like to take that up, but it would fail if the two dynamics were to, the APC would fail if the two dynamics were to stay completely separate and not meet, but it would succeed if there is a way for this to reinforce the enlargement.
Excellent. Thank you, Fabrizio. And Teona, your thoughts on this question? What would you say are the EPC's main strengths and weaknesses, and what will success or failure look like for the EPC?
So we have already mentioned a few times that flexibility and informality are those features that distinguish EPC from other formats. The participants appreciate this opportunity to meet face-to-face, to organize informal meetings on the margins. They value it, and I think that it should not be underestimated. However, I wonder to what extent that flexible agendas and informal proceedings could lead to concrete policy deliverables, if this is what the EPC would like also to provide. And I think the key question probably that the EPC faces today, whether it will continue to be a platform for exchange and deliberation as it is now, or it should acquire a policy role and deliver concrete deliverables. And because these then would certainly bring other issues about the capacity for policy coordination, implementation, the role of the European Union, but probably we can develop it in Q&A session. Another aspect that is also appreciated is the non-hierarchical nature of the EPC. That countries are on equal footing, whether or not they are members to the European Union. I think that we can also, when speaking about success and failure, strengths and weakness, we should look also at the time frame, because we're speaking about a very recent initiative, and the Prague and the Chișinău established the EPC as a top-level forum for pan-continental dialogue in the context created by the war in Ukraine. And so I think that in the short term, that's how I see the utility and the added value of the EPC. So the success should be measured, or can be measured, by its ability to keep European unity in the face of Russia's aggression, and to continue supporting Kiev. This is in the short term. From a longer term perspective, I would say that EPC will need to deliver added value beyond this emergency and beyond this destabilization that is caused by the war. And in doing so, probably there are also two principal challenges. The first concerns the diversity of its members, because we're so diverse in our interests, in our aspirations, that it is not very easy to identify common priorities for 47 countries. And the second probably would be lack of leadership, because we have rotating presidencies. That is good, certainly, especially altering between EU and non-EU countries. But that not all countries that hold the presidency are equally engaged or are equally committed to the EPC. So certainly this rotating, there is this lack of leadership that could certainly challenge in long term the efficiency and the performance of this new forum.
Excellent. Okay, I see we have a few questions, and I just want to restate that please type your questions in the Q&A using the Q&A button. There was a question here, Fabrizio, that you all briefly touched upon already about the Western Balkan countries, but I just want to repeat it nonetheless, and maybe you could expand a little bit on it. It says, is it fair to the Western Balkan countries that they have been in the EU waiting room for about 20 years since the Thessaloniki summit? Is EPC an answer to this?
Yeah, no, I saw the question and I wanted to anticipate it. It's a really good question. A little premise. Whatever I can suggest in relation to the enlargement and the EPC in this regard should not, let's say, neglect and ignore the fact that there is in the region a lot of instability to this day, and we have seen this over the past few weeks in Kosovo and in Serbia. It's often a chicken and egg issue. Can we imagine that this could have been avoided if the countries were given an actual timeline for membership or not? That's hard to say. There is clearly a problem on both sides. That being said, so I mentioned the scheme, and partly by which the EPC would be a sort of political safety net, or rather political support structure for the enlargement itself. Now, what would need to happen in relation to the enlargement, in my view, is three things. First of all, we would need to realize that if the EU will eventually have 35 or 40 members, the ways in which the EU itself works will have to change radically. You cannot have unanimity with 40 member states. It's already a mess now with 27. So you need to really change the ways in which this operates. Same for the European Parliament and the rest of it. The second aspect is that because the process is so slow, or at least so painstaking, it would be useful to imagine, and this has been suggested in several research papers, to move from a process where either you're completely in or you're waiting, into a process where you gradually become members as soon as you fulfill the criteria in a certain group of areas. So if you imagine there are 35 chapters that you have to fulfill, you divide these chapters into, I don't know, 5 or 6 blocks, and then as soon as you have fulfilled each block, the country actually becomes a member already in the blocks where they have finished the homework, so to speak. So it is a sort of staggered approach. Again, it would require a revolution in the way in which this has been done. But if you ask me, it's nothing short of a revolution that we need at this stage. And then there is the third problem, which relates to, what's good enough? What is a good enough level of compliance and a good enough level of meeting the standards when there are inside the EU countries such as Hungary? But I will be very frank, I'm Italian by birth, I'm Italian by nationality. I always say this: if Italy were to apply to the EU today, would Italy qualify for membership? I don't know. But the question remains that you cannot have a standard for exception that is up here while the compliance inside the EU is down here. So realistically, the way to address this is that the level of compliance from some of these countries has to really be an average of what the EU is doing inside the EU. Otherwise, it's literally double standards, literally.
Excellent. And and just following up on that, and that sort of precedes the next question in the Q&A, but maybe Teona, you would like to remark something on this. The question goes: the symbolic role of EPC, which has been stressed upon since its formation, is more or less understood. how can it help in consolidation within the region at the time we can observe the distractive behavior of some EU countries like Hungary? As nowadays, it seems that even EU countries sometimes don't share the same values.
That's right.
Some thoughts on that?
Yes, I will try. Very tough question, but Fabrizio also partially responded in the context of enlargement, certainly.
Yeah.
But I would say that original idea probably was exactly this. You have also read this, you quoted President Macron from his speech in front of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, where he emphasizes shared values, and this was the idea. The idea was to create common, even European democratic communities, I wanted to call it. But then certainly we see that priority has been given to geopolitical considerations. So we are not here. This is a forum where no matter, I think that values don't play a decisive role. What is more important is geopolitical consideration, is exactly unity of Europe in the face of Russia's aggression, is condemnation of Russia's aggression and attack on Ukraine. So certainly there are so many organizations, European Union, but Council of Europe as well, that is focusing on human rights and rule of law and democratic transformations. It is difficult, certainly, but I think that the choice was made and to focus more on where these countries belong to, which club, whether they are with Europe in condemning what Russia is doing in its neighborhood, or so there is no longer in-betweens and buffer zone in terms of also making choices. So that's why I think that here values don't play as the primary role, and mainly geopolitical consideration belonging to this club that is the decisive, and that is the aspect that has been certainly reinforced by Russia's attack over Ukraine. So we see that now geopolitical considerations versus other normative approach to would it be member countries or others, neighbors.
Excellent. Fabrizio, I see that you have a
I wanted to have a follow-up because Teona, I think, gave a really good answer. I wanted to tackle the Hungary question head on. Teona here is still being the diplomat. She's a former diplomat, and I think she has been very good in that regard. No, let me try to take the bull by the horns, if that's possible, because clearly Teona and I were just discussing this, because technically the summits, when they are hosted inside the EU, they are hosted in conjunction with the presidency. So there will be the next summit in Spain of the EPC, then there will be another one in London, and then after that it should actually be in Hungary. And I mean, then the question is, can you conceive having this discussion in Hungary when the country itself, first of all, is deliberately pro-Russian, so the geopolitical argument there applies, and then there is, even if Teona is right, this has not taken the center stage in the EPC, there is a value issue because Hungary is clearly decided to go a different way, and I think we cannot. It's an elephant in the room if we not realize that this is a big problem for us within the EU before even talking about the EPC, but certainly in the context of enlargement. How can we say that A, we want certain standards from some countries while inside the Union we don't uphold them, and B, we have no apparent means to influence a country like Hungary once they become members of the EU. And so I would say the key issue there to answer that part of that question is to start seriously working on the B part of my observation, meaning to sanction a country that is already a member if it does not abide to basic values and rule of law conditions of the EU. There's a lot of literature on this and a lot of scholars, not least in Denmark. I would say Malene Wind is probably the most vocal scholar on these issues. And it is, you know, before you look at the technicalities, which in this case could even include, you know, should Hungary be hosting the rotating presidency of the EU at all? Some in the European Parliament have been wondering this, because how can you conceive that happening? Besides the technicality, there is the fundamental question that it's about time to really do what is called post-accession conditionality, to seriously punish, if necessary, countries that don't abide to the Copenhagen criteria, as it were.
Very interesting. Fabrizio, you also briefly mentioned in passing that there was some relation to the NATO enlargement here. I was just wondering if what that might be, and if there was a follow-up there.
Well, I mean, this is, you know, related very directly to the war in itself, and it's a complex and thorny issue in many respects. We know there's going to be a summit in Vilnius coming up now for NATO, where most likely Ukraine will not receive a signal in the direction of membership. You know, one of the casus belli for the war, the reason for Russia is supposedly the 2008 Bucharest summit conclusion about precisely membership perspective for Georgia and Ukraine. You know, from where I sit, it was a complete incompetent summit conclusion, where something was said about that Ukraine and Georgia will become members, but didn't give any timeline nor the ways in which this would happen, partly because the countries disagreed. At the time, the United States was really pushing for this, and France and Germany were not. But the result was that on the one hand, there was incompetence, and on the other, Russia used this and as a what do you call it, as an excuse to claim that NATO was encroaching on its borders. Again, this is a very long discussion, and I think it is one of those where within Europe, still to this day, we divide a lot into camps. But the point is, now the tables have turned, in the sense that many European countries have actually, not only in Central Europe and Northern Europe, but also France and Germany, have actually come to the conclusion that the only security guarantee that Ukraine can have in the long run will be Article 5 protection, precisely because it does no longer have nuclear weapons, which is, you know, what it gave up back in the 90s. But it's the United States, paradoxically, that is a little bit more reluctant, and as opposed to 2008. So I don't think there will be any movement on this in Vilnius. But given that this is a war that does not, unfortunately, have an end in sight, the issue will not be resolved anytime soon, because simply you realize that the moment Ukraine was actually given an accession perspective while still at war, it would be a way for NATO to say we are now party in the war. So it's a bit of again a chicken and egg thing, but it is, in the last instance, a question of if, a question of when, not of if. And of course, the only way to resolve the timeline and the timing is to ensure that Ukraine wins on the battlefield.
Excellent. We are slowly approaching the hour. I just wanted to hear if any of you had any last burning remarks. Teona, something on your mind, or Fabrizio that you would like to conclude with? Otherwise, I would also just point to the Q&A, where Eric has posted an interesting resource and a piece of old history. I won't read it to you here, but I'm sure that you can all see it. There are also some links in the chat for the policy brief that we mentioned, that Fabrizio has has written, and also an opportunity to sign up to our newsletter. So that is all the vlogs I will do here for the DIIS material. But Teona, Fabrizio, I wonder if you have any final
yes,
remarks?
I would like maybe to have one concluding remark, more of an let's say theoretical nature rather. We have been quite hands-on in our discussion, as it should be. But if you want to really try to put this in a theoretical or intellectual framing, a lot of the way in which the EU dealt with countries at its periphery, not only in the east but also in the south, was effectively to reinforce the Russian view, meaning that they were buffer zones between the EU and Russia. I mean, it could in practice use a different language, trying to say we do a free trade deal, we do a mobility of people, but in practice it was a way of sort of fudging the ins and outs and say this is a common space for experimentation. I would say the war has changed a lot of things, but one of the things that has changed is that way of understanding the wider European geography, if you like, no longer holds. You cannot have buffer zones anymore. You cannot have countries that are, somewhere in between. There will have to be countries that are in and countries that are out. I'm not presuming that Russia one day will not change and be again open to a civilized and acceptable level of interaction. But for the time being, and this is what the EPC ultimately is about, it is that we can no longer afford ambiguity. So there has to be ins and outs, and the EPC is part of the answer.
Excellent.
I would only agree with Fabrizio's assessment in relation to neighborhood policy, in relation also to what he mentioned about 2008 NATO decision not to grant membership action plan, but instead recognize that one day Ukraine and Georgia would become a member. So this was ambiguous approach, but it did not really help. So the aim was to stop Russia, so to avoid Russia, not to irritate Russia, and to stop what it really did not manage to stop. So we can even say that maybe it even provoked, because from Russian perspective, this was also perceived as signals of not engaging really sufficiently enough in this region and letting this region in between Russia and so Russia benefited also from this ambiguous approach. And Fabrizio mentioned this change that we're witnessing. Zeitenwende is not only German reality, but now we see in France. And I think that probably, yes, I assume that the EPC is also, maybe there might have been different initiative, different motivations that led French to come up. But I think that in this process of this overall European Zeitenwende, European political community can play a role in bringing these countries together, in connecting these countries, and in building community and confidence and trust between those who are part and who are not part of it. And probably this is a symbolic and political, but very important value in this context. And as for the future, I think that this will depend. Certainly, the aftermath of the war will show to us what could be other roles that we could all enlist on the EPC. In trust.
Excellent. Thank you. We will have to leave it there, but also a very good place to end it. And we could have talked more, and there are more questions to answer, but maybe there will be a chance to follow up on those as we see how the EPC develops over the coming years. And so I just want to thank all participants for joining today, and thank you, Teona and Fabrizio, for sharing your insights on the EPC. And we hope to see you and the audience again for a future DIIS webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.